There's an old tale about a house that holds not just walls, but secrets tangled within its very foundation. One night, when everything seemed perfect, a terrifying truth emerged, ready to change everything. Edmund Wall wore a smile, but his eyes betrayed a deeper fear, one that could alter not just his life, but the fate of everyone in the village forever. What he did that night wasn't just an act. It was a decision that would shape the future of everyone involved. This story isn't just about that night. It's about the dark secret locked behind an old key and a closed door. Are you ready to uncover the truth hidden within? It was a cold, sharp-edged October morning in Ravensbrook, the kind that seemed carved from glass and ash, with wind whispering secrets through half-bare trees, and the earthy scent of smoke curling in lazy ribbons from aging chimneys. The village, nestled in its usual stillness, looked like something preserved in amber, quaint, quiet, and untouched by time. But beneath its well-trimmed hedges and ivy-wrapped cottages, a strange unease had begun to grow, as though the land itself was aware that something old had been disturbed. At the edge of the village green, Miss Edith Vale, a silver-haired widow with piercing grey eyes and a mind as precise as clockwork, sat beneath a shedding sycamore tree, snipping the final bloom from her frost-bitten roses, her fingers steady despite the cold. Across from her, wrapped in a navy shawl and crackling with barely contained curiosity, sat Margaret Everleigh, the vicar's outspoken sister-in-law, who lowered her teacup suddenly and leaned in with the urgency of someone burdened by a secret too large to carry alone. "You've noticed him, haven't you? That peculiar man who took up in Briar Hollow?" she asked in a sharp whisper, her breath fogging the air between them. Miss Vale didn't answer at once. Her eyes drifted toward the far lane, where the silhouette of the infamous house loomed behind a veil of creeping mist and thorns. "Mr. Elric Morn," she said softly, her voice lined with thought. "Keeps odd hours. Never uses the lane. I've seen him, twice, always entering through the cellar steps as if he's afraid of something behind him." Margaret's eyes widened. "There's no front door, Edith. Sealed clean, bricked over. Hasn't been touched in decades. What kind of man chooses a house like that? One that won't even let the light in?" Briar Hollow had always been the subject of fireside tales. Built in 1897, by a reclusive architect, rumored to dabble in the occult, the house had a strange geometry that unsettled even passing glances. Locals said it was cursed, that doors refused to stay shut, mirrors cracked on their own, and shadows sometimes moved without cause. But its most whispered trait was the vanished front entrance, once grand, now hidden behind layers of stone and vine, as though the house itself had swallowed it whole. Elric Morn, a pale silver-templed gentleman with hollowed cheeks, and a voice like fading velvet, had arrived without announcement, and slipped into the place as if he belonged to it, or it to him. He never came to church, never attended market, and only spoke through his maid, a fragile, soft-footed girl named Cora, whose haunted eyes flickered at every creak of the floorboards. She came into town only when necessary, buying odd things, herbs that no one used, paper so old it crackled, and once a sack of black candles. People whispered that Morn collected locks, ancient rusted things with no keys, and spent hours murmuring to them as though they could answer back. Then one fog-wrapped Sunday, just after the bells of evening service, Cora appeared at the chapel door barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, and her hands streaked with what looked like soot, or worse. She collapsed into Father Halbridge's arms, whispering about doors that had never been meant to open, and eyes that stared from within the walls. When they followed her trembling directions back to Briar Hollow, the house seemed to breathe in their presence. Windows clouded, the chimney silent, the ivy twitching like nerves. Inside they found Mr. Morn in his study, slumped over a desk carved with arcane markings no one could decipher, a dried pool beneath him, and the heavy scent of rust and old wood in the air. The room was locked from the inside, windows sealed, no sign of entry or escape, and in Cora's trembling hand was a brass key, unlike any the constable had seen, ancient and warped, with symbols etched so finely they shimmered like threads under candlelight. It fit the door perfectly, but no one could explain how it came to be in her possession, or why she screamed when they tried to take it from her. The villagers began locking their doors tighter that night. Some said Morn had opened something meant to stay sealed. Others believed he had never truly been alone in that house. As for Miss Vale, she simply watched the moon rise over the trees, and murmured to herself, "Some houses remember, and some things behind their walls are patient, waiting for the one fool who dares turn the wrong key." It was just past 6 on a wind-bitten evening in the village of Aldwych, the kind of dusk that pressed against windows like a warning, and stretched shadows into things they were never meant to be. At the crest of Hawthorn Hill stood Windermere House, an aging manor with frost-blistered walls, shuttered windows, and a silence that felt deliberate, almost alive. Inside, in the study thick with the scent of wax and forgotten ink, Miss Isobel Crane stood motionless, her blue eyes fixed on the lifeless figure slumped over the mahogany desk. The fire crackled faintly behind her, casting flickers of gold across the glass of untouched brandy, the delicate smear of blood around the ivory-handled letter opener, and the pages scattered like abandoned confessions. "How very theatrical," she murmured, her voice too calm, too steady, as though rehearsed, and only young Elsie Wren, the maid hovering near the threshold, heard her. Elsie trembled, as if the air had shifted, as if someone unseen had brushed past her with an icy breath. Outside, beneath a pale and stubborn moon, Windermere stood as it always had, doorless, voiceless, and yet unmistakably watchful, its silence deepening like the pause before a scream. By morning the official verdict had been pronounced in the usual hushed tones. Suicide. Mr. Leonard Quince, the reclusive historian, with a taste for peculiar architecture and darker obsessions, had allegedly driven the blade into his own chest with the methodical precision of a man arranging a dinner guest list. Constable Harrow, a practical man with more certainty than curiosity, deemed it open and shut. The study had been locked from the inside. No signs of intrusion. The only window was nailed shut from within, and the sole key to the heavy oak door was found resting neatly inside the desk drawer. A locked room mystery with a neat explanation, or so they wished to believe. But the room was too clean. No overturned chair, no smudged rug, no sign of interruption. Just the body, the blade, and a single candle burned down to nothing. Miss Crane, who had known Mr. Quince only briefly but keenly, said little though she observed much. The lines of tension frozen in his brow. The slight lean of the body, not towards the blade, but away from it, as though retreating. The scent of something faintly metallic that did not belong. By the time the sun dipped again, whispers had begun to coil through Aldwych like ivy. Quince had no family but left behind 4 key figures. Mrs. Ivy Pembroke, his long-serving housekeeper, with eyes like polished coal, and a mouth that hadn't smiled in 20 years. Jasper Quince, a cousin with debt like an anchor, and charm like a blade, who had arrived the same night as the constable, breathless and far too composed. Marianne Locke, a historian from York, who had once co-authored a paper with Quince, and was rumoured to have quarrelled with him over something more than footnotes. And lastly, Ada Blythe, a violinist who lived in the East Wing as a tenant, often heard playing haunting melodies at impossible hours. Each had motive, each wore masks of grief, and yet only one had eyes that flicked, briefly and instinctively, towards the drawer where the key had been found. But it was what Miss Crane noticed later, during her solitary walk past the overgrown hedges of Windermere, that truly unsettled her. A faint mark, like a thumbprint, on the inside of the sealed front archway. The house had no main door, hadn't for decades. It had been sealed, they said, when the previous owner vanished without a trace. But there it was, a smudge of ash-grey residue, just beneath the lintel. Fresh, human, unmistakable, and it hadn't been there the day before. She stood for a long moment, listening, not for sound, but for absence, and felt the chill of something ancient stirring behind those walls. For houses, she thought, especially those that swallow their doors, do not forget the footsteps of the curious, nor forgive the ones who try to leave. The fog clung to the earth like a shroud, as Miss Marple, draped in her customary walking coat, and clutching a modest bouquet of chrysanthemums, approached the humble cottage of Mrs. Brewer. The old woman, her face etched with worry for her daughter Elsie, who had discovered Mr. Wall's body, received the flowers with a grateful, trembling hand. Despite her anxiety, Mrs. Brewer was soon put at ease by Miss Marple's gentle manner. A pot of tea was made, the steam rising in the cool morning air, and Elsie, still pale but more composed, joined them at the table. Miss Marple, ever the one to offer comfort, murmured, "Such a terrible thing to witness, my dear. It must have been a dreadful shock to find him like that." Elsie nodded, her eyes wide with memories she could not quite articulate. "You were alone in the house at the time." Miss Marple's voice was soft, but the sharpness of her inquiry did not go unnoticed. Elsie, with a quiet sob, explained, "Only for a bit, ma'am. Mrs. Ferris had gone to fetch the grocer's van. Mr. Wall said he was working, and not to be disturbed. I thought it strange when I didn't hear him moving. Later, when I couldn't get a response, I panicked." Miss Marple sipped her tea, considering the details. "The study was locked from the inside, the constable says. Very peculiar, don't you think? And yet, the key was found in the desk drawer." Elsie blinked, the detail lost on her. "I suppose he must have locked it then sat down," she offered, though her voice wavered. Miss Marple's gaze was distant, her mind already working through the puzzle. "Possibly," she said, "though gentlemen planning to die don't usually concern themselves with tidiness. Still, it's a house full of quirks." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple found herself walking the path that led past Greystone Hollow, the house now standing eerily silent beneath the fading light. The building was even stranger up close, its architecture, a display of vanity, grand gables and arches, but within, an inefficiency that spoke of someone more concerned with impressing the world than living in it. As she passed the overgrown gates, Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the sealed front door. The ivy, thick and overgrown, concealed the fact that the door had been boarded up, as though the house were hiding its own secrets. But what truly caught her attention was the ground below the ivy. A disturbance marred the otherwise undisturbed gravel path, a partial footprint, shallow and fleeting, accompanied by a smear of reddish-brown earth. It was the same color she had seen the day before, near the study window. The presence of the clay, out of place on the path, spoke volumes. She crouched, careful not to be noticed, her mind piecing together the oddity. Clay was not native to this area. The soil was dark, loamy, yet here, beneath the sealed door, was this unmistakable trace, as though someone had stood there, close to the house, not so long ago. As she straightened, a small smile touched her lips. The mystery deepened. A sealed door, a smear of clay, a man found dead in a locked room. Nothing fit. But Miss Marple had always believed that evil did not announce itself with boldness. It masqueraded behind the ordinary, behind the everyday, and in its precision, it was far more dangerous. This death had been too neat, too well arranged. The constable, eager for closure, had already made up his mind. Suicide, he had declared. There was no sign of forced entry, no raised voices or signs of struggle. Mr. Wall had been found alone at his desk, a letter opener buried in his chest, a decanter of port nearby, untouched, and not a thing out of place. But to Miss Marple, it was all too perfect, too clean, too orchestrated. She had spoken briefly with Inspector Cray, a man who was more comfortable with conclusions than with complications. But Miss Marple had never been one to accept easy answers, especially when the truth, she suspected, was hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for her to uncover it. Miss Marple moved quietly through the misty morning, her footsteps barely audible against the gravel path. The dampness of the air clung to her woolen shawl as she approached the small weathered cottage. In her hand, she carried a small bouquet of chrysanthemums, their bright yellow petals, a stark contrast against the grey world around her. The fog hung low, wrapping the landscape in a veil of mystery, and she couldn't help but feel that there was something undeniably ominous in the air. She had been to many places like this, remote forgotten houses, where secrets lingered like the dust on old furniture. But this house was different, as though it held a riddle waiting to be solved. As Miss Marple reached the cottage door, it opened to reveal Mrs. Brewer, the mother of young Elsie, who had discovered Mr. Wall's body earlier that week. The woman's nervous glance betrayed her concern as she took the bouquet, thanking Miss Marple with a tight smile. Inside, the air was thick with the tension of things unsaid. The kettle hummed softly in the background, but it was Elsie who broke the silence. Pale, with eyes red from crying, she recounted her harrowing discovery, her words trembling as she spoke of finding Mr. Wall dead in his study. "He was locked in," Elsie whispered. "Locked from the inside. I couldn't get in. The door it was locked." Her voice cracked, and she paused, wiping her eyes. "Locked, you say?" Miss Marple asked softly, a slight edge to her voice, as her mind immediately began its quiet work. "From the inside, yes," Elsie nodded, her expression confused and fearful. The simplicity of the scene, the locked room, the absence of any signs of struggle, seemed almost too perfect, too clean. No footprints, no disturbance, just a man found dead, as if he had chosen to end it all in an oddly controlled manner. "What of the key?" Miss Marple probed gently. "Was it on his person or—" Elsie shook her head. "No, it was in the drawer. We found it later, after the police arrived. The key." The detail stuck with Miss Marple. Something wasn't adding up. A man locked in his study. A key mysteriously placed in a drawer. No signs of violence. And yet the feeling that something much darker was lurking beneath the surface. She thanked Elsie and Mrs. Brewer for their time. But her mind was already far beyond the cottage. Already turning the puzzle over, piece by piece. That afternoon, Miss Marple wandered the grounds of Greystone Hollow. The imposing house where Mr. Wall had lived. The house loomed over her like a silent witness, its tall windows staring out with an almost judgmental air. The gates creaked as they opened for her, and the soft shuffle of her shoes against the gravel was the only sound that broke the stillness. She couldn't help but notice the eerie quiet that hung over the estate. Even the trees, once full of life, seemed to hold their breath. Something felt off. It wasn't just the house, it was the land itself. The air felt heavier, like it knew something it wasn't telling her. She walked slowly toward the front door, pausing to inspect the gravel beneath her feet. There, near the sealed door, Miss Marple spotted something odd, an indentation in the gravel. Not a full footprint, but a mark, faint but undeniable. It was a small thing, easy to overlook, but to Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. She crouched down, examining the earth more closely. The soil was different here, drier, lighter in color. It was clay, not the rich, dark earth that should have been underfoot. She traced the edge of the mark with her finger, her mind racing. This clay didn't belong to Greystone Hollow. It wasn't from the garden. This wasn't a random detail. No, it was a clue, one that had been deliberately left behind, one that the police had missed in their rush to deem it a simple suicide. Her eyes scanned the rest of the area. As she stood, she hadn't missed the locked door, or the perfectly placed key. She hadn't missed the lack of struggle, nor the peculiar stillness that surrounded Mr. Wall's death. As she turned to leave the grounds, she felt the weight of her thoughts settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a suicide. It was something far more complex. Later that evening, Miss Marple met with the others who had known Mr. Wall, Dora Ellen, the young artist who had lived on the grounds, and Mrs. Ferris, the housekeeper, who had seen Mr. Wall's strange behavior up close. Dora was the first to speak, her voice casual as she described Mr. Wall's obsession with locks and keys, with a particular artifact he'd spoken of constantly. A key he insisted was priceless, a relic from the 14th century, something he called the Thorn Key. He was terrified. Someone was after it, Dora said with a small laugh, though there was a nervous edge to her tone. He nearly had a fit when I suggested painting it for a still life. Wouldn't let anyone near it. Interesting. Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, her gaze far away. Sometimes, the obsession with a thing, especially something rare and ancient, can lead to strange behavior. And yet paranoia is often a cover for something deeper, something more sinister. Mrs. Ferris's words were far more cautious, but they too carried weight. Mr. Wall changed his will shortly before his death, she revealed quietly. Said he was setting things right, but he never told me what that meant, only that it had to be done. Setting things right, Miss Marple repeated softly. Perhaps an old injustice was being corrected. Mrs. Ferris nodded, but there was no comfort in her eyes. Or perhaps a new one was being committed. Miss Marple could see the tension in Mrs. Ferris's face, the careful control in her voice. There was more to this story than the housekeeper was letting on. But the woman was hiding something. Miss Marple's mind was working at full speed now, turning over every piece of information she had gathered, every glance, every word that had been said. The locked room, the missing will, the strange obsession with an ancient key. These were all pieces of a puzzle that hadn't quite come together yet. But she could sense it. She could feel the shadow of something bigger, something far more dangerous lurking beneath the surface of this quiet house. With a small polite smile, Miss Marple stood up, her decision clear. She would not leave this place until she had uncovered the truth, until she had unraveled the mystery that lay buried beneath the perfectly constructed facade. She wasn't merely looking for answers. She was listening to the story that the house itself was telling, one that was far more complex, and far darker than anyone had imagined. The truth was in the details, the things that were missing, the things that didn't fit, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye and patient heart, would find them, one thread at a time. There was a flicker in Mrs. Ferris's eyes, as she spoke, a fleeting moment of regret, perhaps, or something deeper, something unspoken. You didn't approve of the change, Miss Marple remarked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a truth only half revealed. Mrs. Ferris stiffened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It's not my place to approve, she said tightly, her gaze never leaving the table. But the old will, it left everything to Master Edmund. The new one, I doubt he'd have liked it much. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple, ever the observer, didn't press further, but the discomfort between the two women was palpable. 2 days after the death of Mr. Wall, Miss Marple found herself seated across from Edmund Wall, in the garden of Greystone Hollow, the grand house where the late Felix Wall had lived in paranoid isolation. Edmund sat beneath the portico, his posture stiff, his face a mask of distant irritation rather than mourning. A newspaper was spread across his lap, the headlines barely glanced at, as he fidgeted with the corner of the paper. His scowl, a permanent fixture, seemed more a reflection of his frustration with life than the grief one would expect in the wake of loss. He greeted Miss Marple with a barely concealed reserve, his politeness strained, as if her presence itself were an inconvenience. "Thank you," he said, his voice flat. It was sudden. Miss Marple, her gaze soft but penetrating, nodded. "Death often is," she replied gently. Her words weighted with the understanding of someone who had seen such things far too many times. "Though sometimes, I think it comes as a relief." Edmund's eyes flickered with something sharp. Was it anger? Or perhaps something more? But it vanished quickly. As he spoke, his voice cold and distant. "Yes, of course. I was shocked. But Uncle Felix hadn't been himself for some time." He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair as he continued, his words coming out in a rush. He was always muttering about thieves, conspiracies, hiding things, locked drawers, refused to open the front door for deliveries. Ridiculous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her voice remained steady, even mild. "And now you're free of it, I suppose." Edmund cleared his throat, the briefest hint of unease flickering across his features. "Yes. Well, we'll see what the will says. Uncle never trusted me, you know. Always thought I was irresponsible. I've done quite well in business, actually. He never understood that the world has changed. Miss Marple gave a soft, almost imperceptible nod. Indeed, she murmured. Edmund offered a tight smile. In any case, I'm sure the solicitor will sort it all out. I'd hate for things to get messy. Miss Marple allowed herself a small knowing smile. Her voice quiet but firm. Messy things often have a way of becoming visible. The smile faltered on Edmund's lips, but only for a moment. The afternoon faded, and Miss Marple's next conversation was with Colonel Dracot, who was trimming the hedges with an almost military precision. When he noticed Miss Marple passing, he offered a quick, sharp salute, his tone blunt. "Wall dead, eh?" he barked. Never trusted him. All those locks hiding something, I say. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Intrigued. "Did you notice anything unusual that evening?" Colonel Dracot's eyes narrowed as he considered. Odd. Always odd with him. But yes, there was something. Heard knocking, I'd say around 10 o'clock. Knocking from Greystone Hollow. Regular. Rhythmic. Not wind. Not an animal. Could have sworn it came from the front. Miss Marple tilted her head, her thoughts turning, spiraling. "Curious," she murmured. "Could it have been an owl?" Dracot scoffed. "Owls don't knock in patterns." Miss Marple's voice was soft but insistent. "No, they don't." 2 days later, just when the matter seemed to have been settled, Constable Finch made a most inconvenient discovery. Sent back to Greystone Hollow to collect Mr. Wall's personal effects, Finch had stumbled upon something unusual in the hearth of the study. Beneath a layer of pale grey ash, the charred remnants of a document. Despite the burn marks, several lines were still legible. The words that had survived were enough to make the village gossip rise again. It appeared to be part of a last will and testament, one that named Edmund Wall as the primary beneficiary. The constable, surprised by his find, immediately called for reinforcements. Inspector Cray returned, his irritation evident as he once again began to probe into Mr. Wall's affairs. Edmund, of course, was quick to respond. "I had no idea," he said flatly, his face betraying nothing. "He never told me he'd changed it. That old document must be from years ago. The solicitor's version is the one that counts, surely." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice smooth. "No objection to us checking with the solicitor then?" Edmund's response was cool, controlled. "None at all." His composure was impeccable. Too perfect. Miss Marple noted. There was no sign of the tight anxiety one would expect from an innocent man, but a faint unsettling confidence that suggested he was convinced of his safety. Later that afternoon, Edmund provided an alibi so neatly constructed it bordered on the absurd. He had been at the Queen's Arms from 8 until nearly midnight, on the night of Mr. Wall's death, drinking brandy and playing cribbage with the landlord, and a pair of traveling salesmen. Miss Marple nodded politely, but as she listened, something about the precision of Edmund's alibi unsettled her. It was too public, too meticulously crafted. An alibi designed to divert suspicion, to make him appear innocent. How convenient, she thought, that it left no room for doubt. If one wanted to ensure the focus shifted elsewhere, this was exactly how one would go about it. The atmosphere in Greystone Hollow thickened with a quiet mounting tension, each passing day adding another layer to the intricate web of suspicion. Edmund's alibi, pristine on the surface, seemed unassailable at first. His time at the Queen's Arms meticulously accounted for, surrounded by witnesses who swore to his presence. Yet, as is often the case in the most enigmatic of mysteries, the smallest of details can unravel even the most carefully constructed facades. The first crack came from an innocuous remark made by Miss Hartwell at the village post office. A woman with an uncanny knack for gathering information without ever appearing to pry. She mentioned with the kind of off-handed curiosity only she could muster, that Dora Ellen, the eccentric artist, had once sent a large check to Mr. Wall just 3 months ago. A curious thing for an artist like Dora, who was known for her barely scraping by sales and bohemian lifestyle. The mention lingered in Miss Marple's mind, as any small anomaly tends to. turning into a whisper of doubt that demanded attention. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to Dora was carefully timed, her hands carrying a tin of homemade shortbread, an offering of kindness as much as a veil for the keenly observed questions beneath her polite demeanor. Dora greeted her warmly, but there was a flicker of something behind her eyes, a slight wariness that Miss Marple did not overlook. The confession came quickly. Yes, she had owed Mr. Wall money for supplies, for framing materials and canvases, a loan she had taken out in the hope of a major art showing that had never materialized. The payment, Dora revealed, had been both sharp and insistent, the kind of reminder that could sour a relationship. But then, just a few months ago, an unexpected twist. Mr. Wall had told her the debt was forgiven, a strange and sudden kindness, especially for a man so obsessed with precision, order and control. In exchange for her debt being wiped away, he had demanded one of her paintings, a brooding dark piece depicting an ancient oak tree that had grown through a locked gate. Dora had found it a strange request, but she had agreed. The painting, she explained, was one of her better ones, though she could never quite understand why Mr. Wall had insisted it had a certain emotional resonance. It was as though Dora mused with a touch of perplexity. He saw something in it that she hadn't. What do you think it reminded him of? Miss Marple had asked, the question lingering in the air like an unspoken challenge. Regret, Dora had replied softly, as if the word itself carried weight. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, took her leave, feeling that the debt Dora owed was real, but no longer relevant. It was a red herring, nothing more than a diversion, and a clever one at that. Meanwhile, Colonel Draycott, ever the keen-eyed military man, offered his own contribution to the puzzle. He had seen something suspicious. Mrs. Ferris, the housekeeper, sneaking into the study long after the constables had sealed it off. She had a torch in hand, he reported, and though he did not confront her, the sight had seemed rather suspect. Miss Marple, always one to follow every thread no matter how seemingly insignificant, decided to investigate further. The next afternoon, she found Mrs. Ferris in the scullery, polishing the silver with the meticulous care of someone engaged in a battle with tarnish. Miss Marple, ever gentle, approached her with a quiet observation. "You must miss Mr. Wall's presence." Mrs. Ferris, her lips tight, gave a stiff nod. "He could be difficult," she allowed, "but he was methodical, orderly. Everything had its place." Miss Marple's next question was a delicate one, but one that could not be avoided. "And yet you found yourself going through his things." Mrs. Ferris froze, her movements stilled. "I was not stealing, if that's what you mean." The words were sharp, defensive. Miss Marple had not accused her, but the suspicion hung in the air. Mrs. Ferris's lips thinned. "There was something," she said, her voice quieter now. "Something he said just days before he died. He told me he'd written something down. A letter. Instructions for Elsie, the maid, but I didn't find it. Why don't you ask the constables?" Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing slightly, noted the hesitation in Mrs. Ferris's voice. She had the distinct impression that Mrs. Ferris was not telling the full truth, that someone, somehow had made certain that whatever Mr. Wall had written would never be discovered. A thought that troubled Miss Marple, for it hinted at something darker than a simple housekeeper's curiosity. It was not until Constable Finch, a well-meaning but clumsy officer, fumbled through Mr. Wall's scorched correspondence, that the next piece of the puzzle fell into place. Amidst the charred remains of bills and catalogues, Finch uncovered something unusual. Wedged between two half-burnt papers was a business card, its edges singed but the name still legible. Ketteridge Master Locksmith. Discretion assured, night and day service. The card stood out against the mundane letters surrounding it, its presence unsettling. Why, Miss Marple wondered, would Mr. Wall, a man so obsessed with locks and security, keep such a card among his possessions? The answer was elusive, yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that this locksmith's card, tucked away and hidden by the flames, was somehow central to the mystery of his death. Was it a simple matter of obsession with locks? Or was there something far more intricate at play, something far more dangerous, lurking in the shadows of Greystone Hollow. As Miss Marple pieced the fragments together, the answers were beginning to emerge, slowly, almost imperceptibly. But one thing was certain: the locked doors of Greystone Hollow were not merely barriers to keep the outside world out. They were barricades to something far more dangerous, something no one had yet dared to uncover. Inspector Cray's investigation had stalled, the delicate balance of certainty and doubt hanging by the thinnest of threads. The evidence, as he saw it, was neatly contained. No sign of forced entry, no tampered locks, the front door sealed, and the study door locked from within. Yet, beneath the cold clinical inspection, a deeper, more elusive mystery brewed, one that the inspector failed to see. Miss Marple, in her quiet corner, spun the threads of suspicion ever tighter. The discovery of the locksmith's card, half-burned and tucked among the charred remnants of Mr. Wall's papers, gnawed at her thoughts. Why would a man so fixated on locks, a man who had such a meticulous relationship with his security, ever call upon an outside locksmith? And why destroy the card, unless perhaps he wanted to ensure it vanished without a trace? The card was a relic of something more sinister, something hidden beneath the very surfaces the inspector was too eager to examine. No lock is invincible, Miss Marple murmured to herself, a small knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips as she pondered the possibilities, her mind far from idle. After all, what was a lock without trust? And what was trust but a fragile thread that could be easily severed? Trust, as Miss Marple knew all too well, was the first casualty of murder. 3 days after the funeral, still clouded with rumors and half-spoken regrets, Miss Marple returned to Greystone Hollow. The house, still heavy with its secrets, seemed to pulse with the tension of unanswered questions. Mrs. Ferris, pale and drawn, accepted Miss Marple's casserole dish with an air of formality. But there was something more, a flicker of unease that slipped from her lips as she mumbled her thanks. As was customary, Miss Marple asked to pass through the hallway, ostensibly to admire the old woodwork. Mrs. Ferris, ever the dutiful housekeeper, acquiesced, oblivious to the deeper purpose behind the request. The hallway, once grand, now seemed cold and lifeless, the silence thick enough to choke a breath. But it was the front door that caught Miss Marple's attention, as it always had. Her eyes, sharp as ever, immediately noticed the faint smear of red clay beneath the doorframe, not outside, but inside, oddly placed, as though it had been deliberately pressed into the worn fibers of the Persian runner. The rest of the floor was immaculate, untouched, as it always had been under Mrs. Ferris's vigilant care. Yet this stain, this anomaly, could not be explained away. No workers, no rain, no tracks from outside, just this one stubborn blotch. The puzzle deepened. How had it come inside? The front door had been sealed, yet someone had clearly crossed its threshold from within. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Miss Marple began to piece the mystery together, her mind working with the precision of a lock's inner workings. Someone had been there, someone had used that door, and they had taken extraordinary care to ensure it went unnoticed. But like any truth, it had left a trace. By the end of the week, Miss Marple had gathered the whispers of Greystone Hollow, and found herself surrounded by more questions than answers. Edmund Wall remained an enigma, his composure so rigid it could have been carved from stone. Yet beneath that perfect exterior, there was something off, a faint but persistent undercurrent of fear, a breath held too long. Dora Ellen, the artist, her impulsive nature seemingly at odds with the measured cruelty of the murder, showed only sorrow, genuine, aching sorrow. It was clear to Miss Marple that Dora had no part in the death, but her grief was like an open wound, raw and exposed. And Mrs. Ferris, caught between loyalty to her late employer and a deep paralyzing fear, seemed to know more than she let on, yet held her secrets tightly behind locked lips. The house itself, too, had its own stories to tell. A sealed door with traces of red clay inside, a burnt business card with a locksmith's name, and a torn half-faded will, all pointing to a singular, unsettling conclusion. Miss Marple's mind turned over the facts, each piece of evidence slipping past her like water through her fingers. But she could not shake the feeling that something far darker lurked just out of reach. The constables had moved on, their interest waning. But Miss Marple was not so easily swayed. Greystone Hollow, with its quiet corners and long cold hallways, held a truth that no one had yet dared to uncover. And she, Miss Marple, would be the one to bring it into the light. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, the stillness of the room pressing in around her like the weight of a hidden secret. The pieces of the puzzle were finally beginning to align. But there was something elusive, something just beyond reach, that continued to slip away, no matter how hard she looked. It was as if the answers were sitting right in front of her, tucked into the folds of the very house that had once been so secure in its mystery. The red clay. How had it come to be inside the house? The sealed door so carefully maintained, yet so obviously tampered with in ways no one had considered. No, there was more to this than the casual observer might have guessed. There was something deliberate about the clues, something that spoke not of random chance, but of intention, of someone trying to craft a story where none existed. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the locksmith's card, half burnt to ash, and the oddities of Mr. Wall's obsession with the locks. The more she examined it, the more it felt like an elaborate dance of misdirection, where every false step led the detectives further away from the truth. But in her mind, the locked door wasn't just a barrier, it was a symbol of everything that had been hidden. Something had passed through that door, something or someone, and it wasn't just a matter of a forgotten key. The house was not as impenetrable as it seemed. It was a labyrinth built to conceal, not protect. The village had all but forgotten the death that had occurred within its walls. But Miss Marple knew the truth was still there, waiting to be uncovered. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the final piece of the puzzle lay in the stonework of the house itself, in the very walls that had been designed to keep people from seeing what was hidden within. A visit to Thomas Arkwright, the village's retired stonemason, confirmed what she had suspected. The front door had never been properly sealed. It had been a deception, a cleverly executed performance to fool everyone into thinking it was impervious to intrusion. But even the most convincing illusions fade in time, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like light, would always find its way through. The constables had focused on the ashes of the old will, but Miss Marple's instincts led her elsewhere. She knew that the change in the will wasn't just a simple matter of inheritance. It was an act of exclusion, a deliberate erasure of someone who had been too ambitious for their own good. And when she visited Mr. Bletchley, the solicitor who had handled the new will, her suspicions were confirmed. The document was valid, but its contents were chilling. Mr. Wall had not only cut his nephew out of the inheritance, he had gone further, bequeathing the entire estate to the British Museum, a museum that had no room for his bloodline, only for his collection. Miss Marple's thoughts swirled like the smoke from a candle about to be snuffed out. The pieces were falling into place, but one question remained: what was Mr. Wall trying to hide, and who had wanted it so badly that they were willing to kill for it? Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit room, her mind racing as she mulled over the evidence, feeling the weight of each new discovery pressing her closer to the truth. The sealed door, the cryptic message in the book, the strange pattern of red clay, each seemed to connect, yet in a way that was more unsettling than clarifying. Edmund Wall's sudden exclusion from the inheritance had seemed like the act of a man making a cold, calculated decision to sever ties. But why? Miss Marple's years of experience told her that the sharpest acts of revenge were rarely driven by hatred alone. They stemmed from something deeper, the burning ache of loss, the relentless feeling of having something that was once yours snatched away without explanation or mercy. As the pieces began to align, Miss Marple asked Mrs. Ferris, with her customary delicacy, for one final look inside Mr. Wall's study. Mrs. Ferris hesitated, her lips pressed tight as if holding back more than she dared to speak, but eventually she acquiesced, guiding Miss Marple through the familiar space, heavy with the smell of ancient paper and dust. The room was still, almost unnaturally so, as though even the air around them dared not disturb the quiet. At first glance, nothing had changed, except for one unsettling detail. The desk, a polished mahogany behemoth, was too orderly. Miss Marple's fingers drifted across the surface with practiced ease, her touch light yet deliberate. It was then, almost imperceptible, that she heard the faintest click, a sound that seemed too small for such a large room, but was unmistakably a signal. A hidden compartment slid open smoothly, revealing a worn leather-bound book. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she scanned the pages. Her fingers halted at an illustration that seemed almost too precise to be a coincidence. A medieval lock, designed to be locked or unlocked only from the inside, with a cunning mechanism that ensured it appeared permanently sealed to anyone on the outside. The accompanying note was chilling in its simplicity, written in Mr. Wall's own hand. Secrecy is the highest form of security, until it becomes isolation. Below it, a name was scribbled in steady, deliberate ink. Edmund. Miss Marple paused, the weight of the revelation settling over her like a thick fog. It was clear now. The door had never been truly sealed. It was a staged deception, a carefully constructed performance designed to trap someone who had been both excluded and erased. The story was becoming clearer, but still incomplete. The next morning, Miss Marple walked with quiet determination to the garden shed at Greystone Hollow. The ground was slick with the weight of recent rain, and the roses sagged under the dampness, but her attention was fixed on something far less delicate. The persistent image of the red clay, faint but distinct, that had marked the threshold of the sealed door. Gardens, she knew, were places where secrets were often buried. As she stepped into the shed, her eyes immediately fell upon a pair of boots. One, still clinging to the remnants of red clay, the other conspicuously absent. The boot was large, worn, its tread matching the pattern she had noted outside the door. It didn't belong to Mrs. Ferris, nor to the Colonel, who was more interested in his polished shoes than in wandering the countryside. But Edmund Wall, yes, he had once rambled through these very hills, wearing boots like these, before he had changed into a more refined London-style wardrobe. Miss Marple's thoughts flickered back to a parish charity sale just months before, when the boots had been offered, only to be reclaimed by Edmund himself. And now, here it was, proof of his presence, proof of access, enough to shift suspicion from doubt to certainty. The piece of evidence was so small, yet so significant, it unraveled everything. As she sat by the fire that evening, her notebook open and her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, Miss Marple felt the final strands of the mystery tighten. The clues were no longer scattered. They were a story, meticulously crafted, almost perfect, except for the one flaw that now gleamed in her mind like a sharp shard of truth. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, an intricate pattern that spoke of a methodical mind at work, one far beyond mere accident or chance. Edmund had long believed himself the rightful heir, but what he had failed to see, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that his uncle's control had never wavered, not in life, and certainly not in death. The false door, hidden within the house like a secret folded into the very bones of the structure, was no ordinary design. It was a masterpiece of concealment, a lock crafted not to keep things in, but to keep truths out. The rare catalogue, detailing the peculiarities of ancient mechanisms, was not just a collection, but a manual for control, and in the margins, where Edmund's name had been written, was not a sign of inheritance, but of betrayal. The burned will, almost too conveniently destroyed, had whispered a lie to all who sought answers, suggesting Edmund's fate was still sealed in his uncle's will, but it was nothing more than a carefully planned diversion. Felix Wall had left nothing to chance. His last testament was not for his nephew, but for a cause greater than both. His legacy was to be preserved, not passed on in the quiet halls of a museum. But Edmund, desperate and cornered, had acted, with the key, a forgotten relic from years of inheritance long sealed. He had slipped through the conservatory's side entrance, confronted his uncle, perhaps threatened him. But when words failed, a swift blow followed. He had crafted the scene with surgical precision. The wine glass, the desk, the weapon left behind. And then the clever use of the locked door mechanism. A perfect alibi. But what he did not account for was the persistent persistence of truth. A single boot, caked with red clay from the very path outside the supposed sealed door, had betrayed him, leaving the trace of guilt that could not be erased. Miss Marple, with her gentle gaze and unfailing memory for the smallest of details, had noticed the clue no one else had. She had seen this before. The false security people build around themselves, thinking they can trap truth as easily as they lock a door. The boot, the clay, the hidden path, it all led to one undeniable conclusion. Edmund had used the reverse latch of the door, the lock designed not just to protect, but to deceive, knowing no one would think to check it. He had walked out of the house, leaving behind the illusion of a mystery unsolved, but in doing so, had forgotten one thing. Lies, like footprints in the mud, are hard to erase. Miss Marple sat in the comfort of her familiar armchair, the fire crackling in the hearth, her mind racing through the pieces of the case, each detail becoming clearer, more precise. She had followed the trail, not with brute force, but with a quiet, patient determination, knowing that human nature, in all its flawed simplicity, would always leave a mark. It was the smallest of details, a boot, a thread, a forgotten key, that had undone the murderer's carefully woven story. Now, as the village fell silent, and the truth settled like dust in the still air, Miss Marple knew it was time to gather the players. Tea was served, but no one was there just for tea. The conversation began innocently enough, with mild chatter, and the rustling of teacups. But Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from Edmund, her gaze sharp and observant. When the moment came, as it always did, she spoke softly, her voice a mere whisper against the clinking of china, but the words carried with them the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Truth, she mused, is like water, it always finds its way, no matter how many stones are laid in its path. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Edmund's fingers froze around his cup, his gaze flickering ever so slightly. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but it held the calm before a storm. Your uncle, she continued, wasn't the one who sealed his fate. He left behind a house full of locks, and one key that leads directly to you. And with that the storm broke, the carefully constructed illusion crumbling with the softest of words. The room grew heavy with silence, as Miss Marple's words lingered in the air, each syllable cutting through the tension like a scalpel through cloth. Edmund sat unnervingly still, his eyes flickering with a brief flash of panic before quickly masking it behind a veneer of feigned indifference. The subtle turn of a key, a misstep, the creeping tendrils of doubt began to unfurl, and it was clear to Miss Marple that the pieces had long been in place, waiting to fall into their proper positions. The documents, the signed will, the locked doors, the false narrative of suicide. Edmund had been confident, almost arrogantly so, that he had outwitted them all. But there were things that couldn't be hidden, no matter how careful one was in crafting their perfect alibi. The muddy bootprint, so casually dismissed by others, had now become the key that unlocked the entire mystery. It was a print that matched the exact pattern of the boots Edmund had worn during the village fete. A detail so small, so easily overlooked, yet it had caught her eye, just as the mismatched puzzle pieces always do. Her voice, calm and unwavering, continued to unravel the lie as she spoke of the key, the old lock, and the door everyone assumed could never open. A door that had been designed by his uncle, Felix Wall, not as a symbol of impenetrable security, but as a trap for anyone foolish enough to believe it could never be breached. Miss Marple had known the truth all along, not because of grand revelations or dramatic confrontations, but because she understood the quiet power of human nature, the desire to preserve, to control, to hide one's mistakes behind a carefully constructed facade. Edmund had used the myth of the sealed door to cover his tracks, never once considering that someone might question the impossible. might look at the very thing that everyone else had accepted as fact. The key, the prints, the locked room, all of it fit together like a perfectly crafted lie. And yet it was the smallest of truths that had revealed it all. Edmund's attempt to preserve his uncle's legacy by committing the murder was not done in a fit of rage or desperation, but with chilling calculated precision. The motive wasn't one of anger, but fear that his inheritance would slip away into the hands of strangers, into the cold, sterile halls of a museum, where bloodlines held no weight. Miss Marple, in her quiet wisdom, had known that the truth always has a way of emerging, like water seeping through cracks in stone, no matter how many layers of deception one tries to pile on top. And as Edmund's gaze faltered, his grip on his composure slipping, Miss Marple allowed the truth to settle in the room like a heavy fog, knowing that there would be no escape for him now. The room was suffused with a heavy, almost suffocating stillness, as Miss Marple's words fell into the silence, like a weighty stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples of disbelief through the gathered company. Edmund, his face pale as the gravestone that loomed in the distance, remained motionless. His breath was shallow, each inhalation a struggle, as if the very air in the room had thickened with the gravity of what was being uncovered. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unwavering, as she dissected the mystery with the precision of a surgeon. "You left the front door open," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but cutting through the tension with surgical clarity. Edmund's lips pressed tight, his mind racing, but his body remained frozen in place. The clock in the hall ticked on, the only sound in the room, marking each passing second with inexorable finality. "Of course," Miss Marple continued, her voice taking on a softer, more contemplative tone. "The final element was the key. The spare key that you thought had been lost long ago." Edmund's head jerked up, his eyes betraying a flicker of panic. But Miss Marple, calm as ever, pressed on. "It wasn't lost, was it? Forgotten in some drawer or pocket? You had it all along, the key to the front door. And on the night of the murder, you used it, not the door everyone thought was sealed forever, but the very door you knew could be opened with the key you had kept hidden." Edmund's breath caught in his throat, and for the first time he visibly trembled, his palms slick with sweat. "You thought," she went on, "that the locked room mystery would be enough to divert suspicion. The letter opener, the glass of port, the locked door. It was all part of your performance, a play, well rehearsed, staged with meticulous care. But in the end, it was all just a performance, wasn't it, Mr. Wall?" Edmund swallowed hard, the taste of his guilt bitter in his mouth. Miss Marple's eyes never wavered from his face, a quiet understanding in her gaze as she continued, unraveling his carefully woven lie. "The door wasn't sealed," she said, her voice a whisper now, but each word a sharp thrust. "It only appeared to be so. And the moment you left, under the cover of night and myth, you believed no one would question the impossible. You left quietly, as if the world were none the wiser." Edmund's face drained of color, his body rigid as he absorbed the full weight of her words. And then finally, the truth escaped him, not in the forceful outburst of a guilty man cornered, but in a broken whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he murmured, his voice small, barely audible, as if the confession itself had stolen all the strength from him. "But once I changed the will, I couldn't let him take everything from me." His shoulders slumped, his eyes empty of the arrogance that had once defined him. "I killed him." The room fell silent. The confession hung in the air, the weight of it pressing down on everyone present, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer, acknowledging the terrible truth. Miss Marple, however, said nothing for a long while, simply nodding, her expression a mixture of quiet resolve and gentle understanding. The morning after Edmund Wall's confession dawned slowly over St. Mary Me, a grey mist curling lazily around the edges of the cottages. The birds, typically the first heralds of day, had not yet begun their chorus, and for a moment the village held its breath, as if the very earth was waiting for the news to break. The constable arrived at Greystone Hollow with deliberate steps, his boots careful on the damp gravel, the weight of the law hanging heavy on his shoulders. Edmund stood by the front door, pale, his body taut with an unease he could no longer disguise. As the constable explained the formalities of the charges, Edmund's response was a quiet nod, his mouth dry as dust. The words had already been spoken, and now they simply had to be made official. "I'm ready," he murmured, the sentence hanging like a final decree, his voice brittle, as if each syllable were a stone added to the weight he would carry forever. The villagers, as ever, were quick to notice. Whispers spread like wildfire, carrying disbelief, shock, and even a hint of sympathy, as they watched Edmund, once a man of standing and respect, now escorted in silence to the constable's wagon. But to Miss Marple, it wasn't the scandal or the shock that caught her attention. It was the quiet inevitability of it all. A man who had once played his cards with secrets and lies, now had no choice but to face the consequences. Justice, she knew, always finds its way, even when it seems to take its time, creeping in like the dawn, soft, unnoticed at first, but undeniable once it arrives. Later that morning, Mrs. Ferris stood at the back door of Greystone Hollow, her eyes bloodshot from a night of sleepless worry. Her posture was rigid, as if she were still holding on to the remnants of her composure. Though the villagers had whispered of her possible involvement, Miss Marple had never believed it. No, her instincts told her there was something else, something deeper and more subtle at play. Something about Mrs. Ferris told her that while Edmund may have taken the ultimate step in betraying his uncle, Mrs. Ferris had always been more than what she appeared. She had been a fixture in the household, yes, but there was more to her story, and Miss Marple knew that, in time, it would come to light. As the weight of her guilt seemed to settle like a heavy fog around her, Mrs. Ferris stood in the garden, her eyes red and puffy, yet her expression was one of quiet resolve. It wasn't the truth that terrified her, it was the fear of the irrevocable mistake she had made, the fear that her loyalty, once steadfast, might have been placed in the wrong hands. She had been too loyal, too silent, thinking she was protecting a man who now seemed to be a shadow of his former self. But now, standing in the dimming light of dusk, she felt the crumbling walls of her loyalty begin to crack. When Miss Marple approached her, it was as though the universe had finally allowed Mrs. Ferris the space to breathe. In a voice that trembled with exhaustion, she confessed, not in sorrow, but in a quiet admission of the truth she had buried deep within for so long. "I knew, Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. "I knew something was terribly wrong, but I thought if I stayed by his side, if I remained loyal, I would protect him from himself. But in the end, I only protected the lie." Miss Marple's gaze was unwavering, her understanding silent yet profound. "Loyalty," she said softly, "sometimes becomes a shield for the wrong cause. You thought you were saving him, but instead you were helping bury the truth." Mrs. Ferris nodded, tears welling in her eyes as the crushing weight of her actions slowly lifted. It was in that moment, amidst the roses and the fading light, that she finally understood. The truth, like the relentless tide, would always come crashing in, no matter how much we try to hold it back. As the village slowly began to awaken from its deep slumber of suspicion, Dora Elkins found herself standing before a blank canvas in her studio, the brush gripped tightly in her hand. The house at Greystone Hollow, once a monument to secrets and hidden dangers, now felt like a distant memory, a symbol of what had been and what was no longer. As her brush swept across the canvas, she painted the house in shades of dark, melancholic blues and grays. Yet in the center, a thin sliver of light broke through the shadows, representing the fragile hope that had finally emerged. The door she painted appeared sealed, but through the cracks the faint outlines of figures could be seen, figures who were finally free from the chains of their own hidden truths. Miss Marple had always said that art reveals what we most fear to confront, and Dora's painting, filled with light and shadow, became a testament to the power of truth. Outside, the evening sky deepened, the last remnants of daylight fading into a soft twilight. As the first stars began to appear, Miss Marple sat in her garden, The same garden where the mystery had begun to unravel. Her thoughts quiet but piercing. She thought about how people, in their desperation to protect themselves, often built walls, physical or emotional, only to realize that the walls were never as strong as they believed. It's curious, she mused to herself, watching the faint outline of a bird take flight in the distance. How we think secrets and lies can shield us. How we believe we can control the narrative. But in the end, truth always finds its way in, creeping through the cracks, no matter how tightly we try to seal them. The silence around her was peaceful now. The weight of the past lifted from her shoulders. Justice had been done. But more than that, Miss Marple understood that the truth was never lost. It was only hidden, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And now, as the birds began their evening song, and the cool breeze brushed against her face, Miss Marple felt an undeniable sense of satisfaction. The puzzle had been solved. The secrets had been unveiled. And the weight of human nature in all its complexities had once again revealed the final answer. The evening breeze swept through the garden, carrying with it the fragrant scent of roses, mingled with something else, something oddly familiar, like a whisper from the past, or the slow inevitable passing of a season. Miss Marple, perched quietly in her chair, her eyes fixed on the fading light, let the gentle rustling of the leaves fill the silence around her. In a voice barely above a murmur, she spoke softly, almost as if to herself. Locks are for things, not for people. People always find a way in. It was a simple observation, yet one that resonated with the weight of countless experiences. The wisdom that had grown from years of watching secrets unfold, lies crumble, and the truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually find its way into the light. She leaned back, her hands folded in her lap, a subtle satisfaction spreading across her features. The mystery had unraveled. The doors of truth had creaked open, and Greystone Hollow, once steeped in shadows and silence, now stood at the threshold of revelation. As she sat there, the garden blooming around her, Miss Marple could not help but reflect on the story that had unfolded. The story of Edmund, a man whose obsession, fear, and calculated moves had led him down a dark path. But in truth, the mystery was never just about a man's untimely demise. It was about the lengths we go to in order to protect what we fear to lose, the walls we build to hide our flaws, and the fragile nature of our own deceptions. Edmund's actions spoke not just to his desperation, but to something far more universal, our constant, often desperate, desire to control, to protect, and to hide. Yet, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became painfully clear, no matter how high the walls we build, no matter how thick the locks we use to guard our secrets, truth is a force that cannot be contained. Miss Marple had always known this. Truth, like light, will find its way through the cracks, and no matter how dark the room, it will always shine through, revealing the brokenness of our most carefully crafted lies. Edmund had thought he could outrun the consequences of his actions, that he could lock away the truth, and bury it beneath his fears. But in the end, truth was the one thing that could never be locked away, and it found its way into the open, exposing everything that Edmund had tried so hard to keep hidden. The story was tragic, yes, but it also served as a sobering reminder of the fragility of human nature, the way our flaws, our fears, and our desperation often lead us to make choices we can't undo. Edmund's downfall was not just a result of his ambition, but a reflection of the deepest truths of the human heart, the desire for control, the fear of loss, and the mistaken belief that we can shield ourselves from what we cannot face. And so, as Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her garden, her mind wandered to the bigger questions, the ones that had always lingered beneath the surface. If you had been in Edmund's shoes, with everything you thought you were entitled to slipping through your fingers, what would you have done? Would you have chosen violence? Or would you have found another way to cope with the loss? Could you have made a different choice? One that didn't lead to destruction? The questions lingered in the air like the evening mist, and Miss Marple, as always, was keen to understand what drove a man to the extremes he had reached. She knew, of course, that no answer would be simple. The choices Edmund made were born from his fear, and his ambition, the tragic result of a man who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions. But that, Miss Marple thought, was the true tragedy. Not just the loss of life, but the loss of a chance at redemption. As the final light of day slipped away, and the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Miss Marple sipped her tea, feeling the calm of knowing that justice had been done, but more importantly, that the truth had found its way through the cracks. She smiled softly, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. Truth, like light, could not be kept hidden forever. The past would always catch up with us, and in the end, it was the truth that would set us free, not just from the consequences of our actions, but from the walls we had built to protect ourselves from the world. And as the evening continued to unfold, with the soft chirping of the birds and the cool breeze brushing against her face, Miss Marple could not help but reflect on the timeless lesson the story had offered. No matter how high we build our walls, or how secure we think we are behind locked doors, truth always finds its way in, no matter how hard we try to keep it out. And in the end, it is the truth that will reveal who we truly are. If you found yourself in Edmund's position, what would you have done? Was his tragic fate the inevitable outcome of a man consumed by his own fears? Or could he have made a different choice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this gripping mystery and the choices the characters made. And if you enjoyed this tale of deception, fear and truth, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories. Share this with friends and family who enjoy a good mystery, and together, let's continue to uncover the secrets that lie just beneath the surface.